Hello everyone, welcome back to my latest history video. Last time I talked about how the British Raj pillaged India of its wealth and rendered us poorer than we used to be at the time of our independence. Now, one of the many atrocities of the British Raj, one that is now considerably gaining more knowledge of in recent years, but it is still not relatively well known to a lot of Indians, and this happened to be one of the last atrocities of the British Raj right before independence. This relates to a famine that occurred in Bengal around 1943 during World War II, which the then reigning Prime Minister Winston Churchill, in charge of the Indian colony at the time, completely ignored. One could even say, go so far as to say, encouraged it. He even orchestrated it, so to speak. So basically this video is essentially about a famine that was relatively unknown to people at the time, and it still is now. The one that Winston Churchill sort of caused and ignored, and overall not just Churchill but also when it comes to his entire administration, how their indifference to the sufferings of their Indian subjects meant the deaths of about 3 million Indians in the British controlled India at the time during World War II. Now, this famine was a catastrophe in numbers. I have already said earlier that the death toll of this famine has been estimated to be around 3 million. Now, essentially, when we usually think of World War II deaths, we usually think about the deaths that Axis powers like Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan caused to the countries they conquered. But very few know about the deaths that were caused on the Allied side, on the side of the winners. The winners themselves extracted a heavy death toll from the people over the regions they ruled, especially the British in the case of their empire. And this famine, which occurred in British controlled Bengal at the time, extracted a death toll of 3 million. Then now, as I said earlier, during famines, normally the prices are kept under control by the reigning administration to feed the people. Exports are usually stopped, and either prices are abolished or they are kept at a bare minimum so that people could afford food to satisfy their hunger. But here in the Bengal famine, it was the reverse situation. The prices of food grains at the time were said to have increased by by an exorbitant amount at the time, mind you, of over 950. This was largely because of British policies of hoarding food to feed their own people, that is the British people and other white peoples, then middlemen's, then the now middlemen, I would say the actions of middlemen. Even now, the basically when the food is directly sold to us by farmers, it comes much lower. But when middlemen are involved, they usually inflate the prices by involving their own commission. They extract a commission from us buyers as well as from the farmers, ensuring that they pocket most of the profits, with consumers bearing the burden of high prices and farmers ultimately gaining little from those prices. So here also middlemen largely played a role. British middlemen as well as Indian traders also, they are said to have stockpiled heavily on rice at the time, or hoarded rice, so to speak. So this hoarding means that there was artificial scarcity of food in the market, which led to this inflation. Then because this was a time of war, there was a threat of invasion on the eastern side of India, eastern borders of India. So to counter such invasion tactics, the British government impounded some 66,000 plus boats. These were vessels which were seized to prevent the said invasion. Of course, the problem with this impounding was that this also deprived the people residing there of a source of livelihood. Bengali people depended upon these boats to transport paddy, and not only that, they also relied heavily on fishing for their as a means of livelihood, which the destruction of these boats meant that even fishing was not as much possible as it used to be before. We'll explore all this in detail later. Then there is a book, the source of this video and one of the most popular books written is by an Indian author named Madhushri Mukherjee, a very eminent Indian author. She stays in America. I think she had written a book called Churchill's Secret War. In this book, she has essentially expounded upon the true nature of the famine as an artificial famine. Mind you, the famine was not caused because of lack of rainfall, as is typical in case of droughts. There had actually been a sufficient amount of rainfall, and the harvest had been very high. This famine happened largely because of the extractive policies of the British government at the time, as was typical of colonial rule throughout the 2 centuries of their rule over us. So basically the British policies of extracting food from the people, hoarding it, and prioritizing feeding their own and other white peoples over us meant that the famine only became worse until those 3 billion people died. And while our people were starving, India was forced to contribute, according to the author, nearly 2 billion pounds in today's word to the war effort. And she says that the food that was extracted in Bengal from the people was used to build up the stockpiles of food in London and European stockpiles to feed the people who were subjugated by the Nazis and who were to be fed by the British after the war was over. Which means that even though these were enemy occupied areas, somehow the British felt that charity to white peoples occupied by the enemy, in a way feeding the enemy was more important than feeding the people uh, they were in charge of, that is us Indian people. So this is a very well-known, extremely good book. It is one of my favorites. I have read it many times. I would recommend it to all of you as well to read Madhushri Mukherjee's book. It's titled Churchill's Secret War. It's about how Winston Churchill, a supposed hero of the West, actually was a genocidal maniac responsible for the deaths of nearly 3 million Indians at the time of World War II. And how, despite measures to mitigate the famine were there, he did not do any of that. We'll explore all of this in detail further. So what was the background of this famine? Now, this was a time of World War II. The Nazis were running rampant all over Europe. The Japanese were conquering the former Asian colonies of the European powers at the time. So they were making a lot of headway. So what happened was the Japanese had managed to conquer Burma, now known as Myanmar, on the eastern borders of India in 1942. So the Imperial Japanese Empire was brought directly to the doorstep of the British Raj. So the British began panicking. So what happened was the Bengal, which was very close to the eastern borders, which were threatened by the imminent threat of Japanese invasion, the Bengal became sort of a military hub. What happened was the British confiscated rice fields and other agricultural fields from the people of Bengal, then repurposed those fields into airstrips, factories and all, in order to be used as a base for the Allied effort against Japan. Essentially, we were drafted into a war in which we had little to no stake. We were drafted into someone else's war, and our land, our resources were used for this. So essentially what happened was, because of the huge pressures of wartime, as essentially war, whenever there is war, a lot of pressure is extracted on the resources of a nation, whether it be on the people or on other types of resources, land or monetary, other monetary resources and so on. So essentially the local resources of Bengal, because Bengal happened to be very close to the border, so particularly on Bengal, the resources were directly pressured. Like I said, the fields were confiscated and cleared to make room for airstrips, for other military bases, for for ammunition factories and so on. Then these fields were also used to confiscate for building roads, for the transportation of troops to the eastern borders of India to defend against the Japanese and so on. Of course, because this was colonial rule, none of this was done with the consent of Indian people. This was all done by the British people on their own, with their own interests in mind, to preserve their own empire at the expense of the welfare of the Indian people. Then what happened was, although the British had been hoarding Indian rice a lot during the war, even before the famine, the hoarding of Indian rice, particularly Bengal's rice, had been happening a lot during the time of harvest. This had not really been much of a problem because the British relied on imports from their Burmese colony on the eastern borders of their Indian colony, in order to supplement their stealing of Indian rice, in a way to placate the Indian people, essentially taking one resource and supplementing it with another. That was what the British used to do to feed the Indian people and to curb any potential source of rebellion on their part. But once the Japanese invaded and occupied the Burma in 1942, the source of rice imports from Burma was cut off for that time. So what happened was, this the essentially the imports were cut off. So which means that, not that this was much of a problem for the British, they continued to hoard rice from the Indian people, but now they could no longer substitute the rice hoarded with the Burmese rice. So the situation became even more serious. So this means that the grain available for the Indian people, or actually it could have been available if not for the policy at the time, but deliberate British extraction policies, the British policy of prioritizing the welfare of white peoples over the Indian people meant that the deficit created was artificial. It could have been avoided. But nevertheless, because of Burmese rice loss, this there was a deficit, a reduction in the availability of grain at the time, some around 15 to 20%, a pretty big number when it comes to supply of food in the region. Then at that time, but then to top it all, the British Raj continued to hoard the rice from us, but at the same time, with the loss of Myanmar, they did not secure an alternate source of rice imports for the people of Bengal or for the other Indian peoples. They did not secure the imports, and they still carried on with confiscating and hoarding the supplies of food from the Indian people for their own benefit. So so essentially this was a very critical supply situation. One was the non-stoppage of a hoarding of food from the local people, then the loss of imports from their other colonies because of Japanese occupation, and failure to secure alternate means of supply. All of this meant that famine situation became more and more apparent. Then there was another policy that was followed because of this. It was called a policy of scorched earth. Now this is one of the more common tactic employed during wartime, where on the threat of an invasion, the defending party usually destroys the land it retreats from to ensure that the supplies of that land, whether it be food or shelter or anything else, is not available to the invading enemy. So this is called scorched death. It has been followed many times during invasions all across history. Even in World War II, when Hitler invaded Soviet Russia in 41, the Soviets, correcting myself, employed this scorched death tactic to deny the Nazi invading forces the supplies of their land. So here also it was the same thing. So how did this policy occur? Well, this policy happened because of the Japanese encamping themselves at the Indian borders with the fall of Burma. So what happened was the rice imports from Burma, which the British used to supplement their own stealing of rice from the Indian people, was cut off. So the fall of Burma in March 1942 turned out to be the starting factor. Then the denial policy of rice started. Now what happened was, the British ordered that any surplus grain in Bengal's warehouses or warehouses across the areas directly in contact with the eastern borders threatened, if there was any surplus grain in those warehouses, that grain was ordered to be removed from there as a part of the policy of squash. Basically, it's a wartime tactic used to deny food to the invading enemy should they succeed in occupying those areas. But of course, this was done at great cost to the Indian people whose consent had not been taken. So this rice denial policy started being undertaken in April, right after the Japanese occupation of Burma. Then next month onwards, what happened was, to make things even worse, the British turned their attention to the waters of our country, especially the Bay of Bengal. So there was this thing called boat denial order. So obviously the British considered the fact that the Japanese could also invade India via the sea. So to prevent that sort of invasion, any means of transportation via water, namely boats, ships and all, which the local people of the region used to ply for their livelihood, whether it be for fishing or transporting of rice. So that those were also impounded, confiscated by the British authorities, or worse, outright destroyed, burned down. So over 66,000 boats suffered this fate. These boats were used by the local people of Bengal, by farmers, by fishermen, people who were just earning means of livelihood. They now had their sources of livelihood cut off just as a part of the war effort. Mind you, a war in which we had no real stake in. We were under occupation by another power, by a power that was heavily oppressing and looting our resources. So we were being made to fight a war which we had no real stake in. But nevertheless, the 66,000 boats being destroyed proved crippling to the Bengali economy, to the Bengali society and all. So all of this were policy driven. This was essentially all artificial. There was no actual drought situation there. There had been plentiful rainfall in Bengal at the time, as historians have found out, and the harvest had been bountiful, plenty mind you. Nevertheless, the British, especially under Winston Churchill's orders, chose to confiscate all this surplus grain for themselves. So in 1943, with all of the policies I have just stated above, the famine happened in Bengal, a starvation crisis leading to about 3 million people dying. Then because there was the, so like I said earlier, there was a policy of boat denial. The British administration employed, chose to destroy the boats used by the people at the time, whether it be fishermen or farmers, for transporting crops to the market and all. Then in 42, about 653 vessels were destroyed. So like I said earlier, the Bengali people, along with growing crops, also relied on fishing as a means of food and livelihood. So because of the destruction of boats there, the fishermen of Bengal could no longer do fishing. So the fishing industry, which was a primary source of livelihood for the poor, rural poor of Bengal. The fish especially contains a lot of protein, which it is one of the staple diets of the coastal Bengali people. So that was essentially robbed of. So essentially this plus the British ensured that not just boats but other internal means of internal transport were also cut off to deny the Japanese any means of invasion. So all of this meant all of this came at great cost to us, to the people living there at the time. They could no longer conduct their source of livelihood, and the British being the rulers they couldn't be bothered to find any alternate means of looking after the welfare of the Indian people. As it is, the welfare of the subjugated Indians was never a priority for the British Raj. What mattered was winning the war at any cost, preserving Britain's status in the world, and welfare of the superior race, the white race, at the cost of the subjugated Indian race. That was what mattered to the British people, to the British Raj. Then, like I said earlier, it wasn't a drought. No, a lot of people believe that there had been a shortage of rainfall, or just neglect on the part of the British government. Mostly that was a drought, a lack of rainfall. But as I said earlier, this was a lie. In 2019, there had been a study conducted by a fellow named Mishra, who had analyzed over 150 years of moisture in the soil of the Bengal, West Bengal, as we must call it now. So they did this. So that analysis proved that the soil actually had been perfectly moist. It had been the best situation for growing crops. And not only and in fact, the historical studies have proven that there actually had been a very bountiful harvest of crop, particularly rice in Bengal, around 42 to 43. 1942 to 43, which means that there was no drought like situation in Bengal at the time. In fact, in 43 they say that right at the time the famine was in progress, Bengal actually experienced above average rainfall, essentially very heavy rainfall, which means that crops could be grown, harvested, and used to feed the starving people. It was perfectly possible to do so. However, the British instead chose to regard this. They chose to steal the food from the people of Bengal, and use it for their own benefit, deliberately starving the people of Bengal. In fact, at the end of the famine, there was an inquiry commission that was instituted to investigate the famine, and confidential documents now disclose that the famine was essentially, like it is written here, scientific evidence confirms that this was a policy-driven famine, unlike others in Indian history. Of course, during the British Raj, not just this, but there were other famines also that had happened. Those famines had been somewhat started by lack of rainfall, but exacerbated by British policy of hoarding and exportation, right? Essentially killing the starving people and robbing them of their food. So, like I said, 150 years of soil moisture proved that the soil was suitable for growing crops, and above average rainfall in Bengal in late 1943. Essentially, all of this proved, and last I said earlier, scientific evidence had proved that this was a policy-driven famine. Essentially, the suitable rainfall, not to mention suitable rainfall, I should say, very sufficient rainfall, above average, mind you, and the suitability of the soil for growing crops to feed the people meant that there was no actual drought. It was a artificial famine, the 1943 Bengal famine. Madhushri Mukherjee's book Churchill's Secret War particularly proves all of it. And there are other sources as well. Essentially, when the Winston Churchill, in his racism, in his hatred towards the Indian people, he chose to hoard the surplus food from the Indian people and put it in warehouses, and then use it to stockpile food for the British people in Britain and for the white peoples in Europe, at the expense of the Indian people. Essentially, the famine was an artificial situation. There was no natural causes to this. It was all man-made. That's what makes this famine even more horrific and tragic. In fact, you could say the Bengal famine could be classified as a war crime on the scale of the Nazi Holocaust, and or any other crime that dictatorships at the time committed. But because Britain and the other allies won the war, so as they say, it's a case of victor's justice. History is written by the victor, and the victors are always written as heroes, and their bad deeds are usually kept secret, kept under wraps. So the Bengal famine was never addressed. The British government never ended up paying the price for the deliberate murder of 3 million Indians. Essentially because they won the war, so they got away with it. Victors in war, those who win, they are able to write history the way they want. They are able to get away with any crimes they committed, and it's never addressed for a long time. Same with this. So what had happened was, even though despite the starvation of Indian people at the time of the war, when millions of Indians were dying due to lack of food, just as had happened during the previous famines under the British Raj, here also it was the same thing. Massive amounts of rice uh, ended up being exported from India during the first half of 43, right at the time when the famine was at its very height, right when Indian people were dying from lack of food. In fact, as I said earlier, there was no actual lack of food. It was all artificial. There had been a bountiful harvest in Bengal at the time, and the rain had been sufficient enough to grow additional food. But the British chose to steal all that food and export it for their own profit and for the benefit of their own white people and other white people during the war, at the expense of the Indian people. Or no, or rather, not just abroad, but even in India also, it is said that the food was not released to the starving Indian civilians, but instead was used to feed the British army stationed in India to repel the Japanese invasion. Which means that not just the needs of the white people abroad, but also the needs of the occupying army in India were far more prioritized than the starving civilians. Then another horrifying fact which has now come to light is, during World War II, to give context to this fact, during World War II, when the Nazis occupied Greece and Greece was teetering on the edge of famine, the Red Cross asked to intervene in the Greek famine, which the Nazis allowed. The Nazis, who were well known for their brutalities and horrors, sort of allowed a humanitarian mission to one of their own occupied regions, despite the risk it could pose to their empire, especially at a time of war. Whereas the saintly British people, the British who claimed that they ruled India for the benefit of Indians, Winston Churchill and his administration in particular, they literally refused offers of food from even their own allies, specifically from the dominions of Australia and Canada, which were very closely allied with Britain, which had made offers of wheat to relieve India. Churchill literally refused it, all because of his racism and his hatred towards Indians, and out of vindictiveness, he refused offers of food from even his own allies. In fact, Churchill's supporters have now argued that there is, so how to put this, Churchill's supporters have now argued that they keep on arguing that Churchill did his best to relieve the famine, but there was no way to relieve it. That there were no that food wasn't being made available by other regions and all. But this is where the proof lies, that Winston Churchill deliberately refused offers of food from even his own allies. In fact, he prohibited Australian or Canadian wheat to be shipped to India. In fact, there have been documents which have been unearthed now which prove that Australian wheat in particular, which was to be shipped to Europe as part of the stockpile to feed European peoples after their liberation from the Nazis, they used to bypass India, and from the ship you could literally see people dying on the streets, all the way, all from that greater distance, right from when the ship was sailing, and you could see starving people on the ports and even further. It was that many people were dying, and the death toll was that visible. And not just that, the the famine was not even that secretive. The pictures of victims of the famine were published in newspapers in India, mind you. Even some white editors took did the conscientious white people who had sympathies for the starving victims also published pictures of the famine on their newspapers. None of that was enough to move the indomitable. None of that was enough to move the racist, monstrous Churchill, who chose to prioritize, who chose to punish the Indian people by killing 3 million of them. Uh, uh, you could say this was an action right on par with the genocidal maniacs like Hitler and Stalin. It was that horrible. Then, like I said, then when it comes to now, coming to what I said, talked about Australian shipping, that was also another thing. Shipping space, it was prioritized for the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. Essentially, Churchill chose to prioritize feeding his own people who are fighting the war on the Atlantic, and feeding the British army across the world who are fighting in various fronts in the war, and the Mediterranean front as well. Essentially, India was made to become the supplier of the world at the cost of its own people. Not to mention, when it comes, essentially what happened was, there are actually documents which are being unearthed which now prove that Churchill deliberately blocked or prohibited shipping to India. Ships which were to be sent to India were deliberately rerouted by Churchill and his administration to other regions. There is historical proof being unearthed. All of this means that the Bengal famine can be considered a genocide and a war crime on par with Hitler's Holocaust, or crimes committed by Stalin or other dictators at the time. Then now not only that, now not only with the actions, even the words of the administration at the time point to what was really a very callous, very insensitive, very dehumanizing response to the crisis. What should have been a normal humanitarian, not just humanitarian, even a normal political response to the crisis, turned out to be a rather horrific, racist, dehumanizing response. This was the statement made by the arch imperialist, the racist, horrible Churchill, was something like this: the starvation of anyhow underfed Bengalis is less serious than that of sturdy Greeks. Churchill was an old school racist who firmly believed that Indians were an inferior species to the white people, that Indians were not worthy to live in the land occupied by the British. So when Indians started dying in numbers, this was what he had to say, that the starvation of Bengalis mattered less than that of Greeks. Mind you, the Bengalis were people subjugated by the British. Churchill was in charge of them. It was his duty to relieve them, and this is what he had to say about the people whose charge he had been put on. By contrast, the Greeks were under occupation by the Nazis, and he focused on relieving them and other European peoples occupied by the Nazis, which is really a case of dark humor, that Churchill chose to starve the people he was in charge of, but chose to somehow believe that the welfare of peoples who were occupied by his own enemies. Mind you, shipping food to them meant there was no guarantee that how long it would take to liberate the European peoples from the Nazis. He might as well have been feeding the enemy in a rather in a case of rather dark humor, gallows humor, so to say. But yeah, racism sometimes can be is just racism is horrible, of course, and this might seem like a politically incorrect statement at best, but Churchill's racism would ultimately prove deadly to his Indian victims. In fact, Churchill's attitude was, in fact, even the other people in his administration were extremely aghast at Churchill's attitude to Indians. His right hand man, Leopold Amery, who was then the Secretary of State for India, it was a post created to administer their Indian colony. He himself had said that I can see very little difference between Churchill's outlook and Hitler's. So someone actually agreed that Churchill and Hitler were in a sense two sides of the same coin. Both were genocidal in their own way. In fact, there is testimony from from Churchill's colleagues that Churchill could be extremely dictatorial in nature, that he had the personality of a tyrant, that when Churchill made all this sort of statements, Amery actually was said to have said this to his face, that his outlook and Hitler's outlook was not too different. And needless to say, Churchill was kind of angry about this, even though it was true. So it's not just a simple case of racism. Even his other colleagues were aghast at how racist and horrible Churchill could be in situations like this. That said, there were allies of his as well. One particularly obnoxious ally was named Professor Chervil, or so now Lord Chervil, I would say, or his real name was Professor Lindemann. He supported Churchill in his famine-like genocide against Indians, and was said to have been his closest advisor. He influenced a lot of Churchill's decisions when it came to the Bengal famine. He and Churchill together exacerbated it. Professor Lindemann was even said to have propounded a theory of the hierarchy of the human races, which is on par with what the Nazis thought of with the Nazi racial theories at the time. Essentially, even though Professor Lindemann was officially an opponent of the Nazis, yet his outlook was not too different from this. The apple doesn't fall very far from the tree, so they say. So Professor Lindemann proposed racial theories that were on par with Nazi theories. So essentially very little difference between them. So from the Indian point of view, that's how the war is perceived as. A fight between two dark evil empires with blood on both their hands. Essentially the British Empire and the then fledgling Nazi Empire. Then that said, not every British official was that indifferent. There were conscientious British officials who attempted to address the dire situation in the country. These officials, they often sent of course these officials couldn't really do anything on their own. They were subordinate to the main governing office in London, so they used to send requests for food aid to London directly. So Churchill in particular and his cabinet, they chose to directly ignore these requests. They essentially used to just dismiss it out of hand, saying that the welfare of the people was not a priority, or that the number of people dying was just exaggerated and all. Even though there were photos literally published in the newspaper which proved that the starvation was not fictional, that the situation was as critical as it was portrayed. Then there was the viceroy. Then mind you, there was this the viceroy called Archibald Wavell. At the height of the famine, when Churchill appointed Archibald Wavell as a viceroy and hosted a lavish farewell dinner for him, mind you, and at a time of war when people were dying, Churchill could actually afford to host a lavish dinner for a needless occasion. Gives you an idea of what his thinking and priorities were. But I have already stated this earlier. So he said that. So it is said that he's said to have made a statement that when we look at across the history and across the world, we see one part of the region that has not seen war for generations, where people have not known any suffering, where they have been shielded from dangers. And he said this was the Indian people, the people of Hindustan. One can only imagine just how delusional and out of touch Churchill was, and how indifferent. That right when millions of Indian people were dying, at a request, at a lavish farewell dinner in the middle of a war situation, mind you, he could make such a obnoxious statement like this. Makes one's blood boil just hearing it. That said, Lord Wavell was a conscientious viceroy, and he assessed the situation, and he sent these appeals for food aid to London, which of course Churchill and his cabinet chose to ignore and resist, or just plain ignore. It took a resignation threat by Wavell in this time of war for Churchill to back down and finally distribute food relief to India. By the time this happened, a lot of our people had already died, 3 million people. Then it is said that when British officials, they used to send desperate requests for food relief to London. At one time, the only reply Churchill ever made to this request was that what he wrote: "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" At that time, Mahatma Gandhi was fasting to death again in response to the as a part of the Quit India movement of 42. No doubt that played a role in Churchill's bitterness. But regardless of how bitter Churchill was, it was still his duty to address the food situation, which he chose not to do. Instead, what he did was, he only asked why Gandhi, who was starving in prison, hadn't died yet. Essentially, he only prioritized political victories over properly administering the colony he was in charge of. Then London also chose to hoard food from the Indian people to create stockpiles in the event of a future liberation of the European people from the Nazis. Mind you, they hadn't been liberated yet. So Britain was not in charge of those people, but still chose to somehow deliver on to somehow how to put this, to somehow undertake a supposedly humanitarian responsibility which need not have been undertaken then, rather than addressing the actual situation that was occurring right then and there in their own colony, in the very place where in the very people whose welfare they were supposed to be in charge of. So this was Churchill's retort, Gandhi being not alive, and London prioritizing stockpiles and all. As I said earlier, the United Kingdom chose to stockpile food. They chose to use intermediaries, artificial inflation and all, to keep the food from the Indian people, and they hoarded food from the Indian people, and they chose to use they maintained a massive stockpile of food for the liberation of Europe. All of this mind you, Europe was still under Nazi control, and they chose to prioritize this in the event of a future liberation, an event which had not yet happened, for which there was no immediate need. But there was an immediate need in Bengal which they chose to ignore, or which they somehow even encouraged, so to speak. Essentially, the British had already planned for the Nazis' defeat and to maintain massive food stockpiles for future in liberation of Europe. Essentially, post-war Europe. Then, when it comes to then when it comes to the shipping space, I've already said that Churchill chose to block all shipping routes to India when it comes to food, instead prioritizing them for the Atlantic front and for the Mediterranean front against the Axis Italy. So the shipping was prioritized for the Balkans, as in the region like Romania, Yugoslavia, and all that, all those regions which the Nazis had occupied at the time, the regions closer to Russia, so to speak. The Churchill somehow had believed that if the Balkans were to be liberated, the food would be needed for them, not for the Bengali people who are inferior anyway. Which means that our people who are literally dying, who literally needed the food, were ignored in favor of people who were not Churchill's responsibility at all. He chose to prioritize a rather vague situation over a concrete situation that was happening right then and there. So what does this highlight then? So essentially, so this is essentially means that Churchill prioritized the future peace in Europe, and he chose to rob food from them. Not just this, there were British businessmen in India also assisted in such similar stockpile. They, rather than releasing the food to Indian people, they chose to send this food to Europe and all for their own profits. And it is said the British government actually encouraged their fellow white businessmen in India to hoard food rather than release it to the Indian people. All of this created an artificial inflation situation in there, which meant people could no longer afford food, and because there was no famine relief, which means that people started dying in droves, and that's what led to the 3 million death toll. Now all of this means that again, just like how it used to be at the time, white people, European white people, their lives were prioritized over the British people's own subjects. Indian people who were being governed by the British themselves, whom the British were responsible for their welfare. It was the duty of the British to administer it was the duty of the British to help to help the people they were in charge of. The British always claimed that they ruled India for their own benefit, right? That was the claim they made, was the justification for their rule. Of course, the Bengal famine and how they responded to it, mind you, how they created the famine in the first place, plus everything else that had happened before this, namely the violent suppression of rebellions, the constant other famines that had occurred before this, all of this gave the lie to this British claim. But any which ways, this situation shows that white people's lives were prioritized over brown colonial subjects and brown and black skinned colonial subjects. So what happened was that this famine, the shortage of food, heavily impacted the Indian people, particularly the Bengali rural poor. It is said that There were people used to die from a lack of, people literally died from lack of food. And especially in the rural areas, in hopes of obtaining food, people used to migrate from the rural areas of Bengal to Calcutta, now Kolkata. So they used to search for community kitchens, some of which had been set up by conscientious people to relieve the famine. So they used to travel there. It is said that during the height of the famine, corpses used to literally litter the streets of Kolkata at the time. There was a eyewitness account where British and American soldiers stationed in there, they once stepped out of a Calcutta cinema, and they were horrified to find people literally dying on the street while vultures circled overhead. Essentially, it was like an apocalyptic situation, something like the end of the world situation. That was what it was like. In fact, so much so that after the famine, they used to have there used to be a policy of the British Army used to have a job of collecting the corpses littered on the street, almost like a job in itself. That was the sheer number of people that died. Calcutta was literally resembled a mass graveyard at the time. Then starvation deaths, right? Now it is said that when there is lack of food, when the body does not have enough nutrition, diseases attack the body um, like uh, like predators pouncing on the weak prey. So even after the starvation deaths, there was a second wave of deaths. So this happened from the various starvation induced diseases like malaria, cholera, uh, no doubt because of the unhygienic conditions at the time, and there were smallpox deaths as well. So this was the second wave. So all of this meant that corpses literally littered the streets of Calcutta. It is said that Jawaharlal Nehru had even made a statement that the presence of well-fed white British soldiers, of course the British administration ensured that the white British soldiers stationed there were well-fed. So the presence of white British soldiers amidst what was an apocalyptic landscape of starving and dying people on the street, it was the final judgment on British rule in India. Essentially, it was the final nail on the coffin of lie that the British had coated themselves with over their supposed just rule of India. So what was the end result of the famine? It led to a breakdown of families. A lot of parents chose to kill their children rather than see them starving slowly to a painful death. Then many used to have literally sell their children to earn money to buy a sack of rice. There was this very famous fellow called Bhaumik Manik Bhaumik, I think. He invented LASIK eye surgery. He also gave an eyewitness account of the famine, how his grandmother used to feed him rice from her own portion, and how she ended up dying because of the situation. Then not then girl then many girls children in particular, they were sold into brothels. There were many brothels which were opened up during the war situation for allied soldiers to pleasure themselves before fighting in the front. These brothels usually consisted of girls who had been sold by starving parents as a means to or to gain money for food, and the hopes that the brothels would take better care of the children than they themselves could. So we know about the Japanese comfort women, that were not Japanese, about the Korean comfort women, mind you. The Japanese in Japan, in Japanese occupied Korea, the Imperial Japanese used to have brothels where poor Korean women were used to pleasure Japanese soldiers. Nobody, this is a relatively less well known fact, but even in British occupied India, especially in famine stricken Bengal, this was the same situation where brothels were opened, starving girls were used as prostitutes for allied soldiers. But of course, because the allies won the war, so this fact needn't have to be and wasn't addressed. So again, this was the horrific reality of the famine that happened in Bengal. One of the last kisses of death that the British Raj would administer India right before it would be snuffed out of existence 4 years later, right alongside the other being the partition of India. Then there have been many authors, there have been a couple of authors, two authors in particular, namely the eminent economist Amartya Sen and the author I just spoke about, Madhushree Mukherjee, who wrote the book Churchill's Secret War, of which I am a proud owner, and the research from that book forms the basis of this video. So Amartya Sen, he identified uh, inflation and entitlement failure. Essentially, he made it clear that he considered rising prices, exorbitantly high prices, and entitlement, as in failure of the British government to address the famine properly, or prioritizing their uh, essentially failure of the British policies as a response to famine. Essentially, Amartya Sen believed that economic situations and political policies of the government, necessary policies from his perspective, caused the famine. Essentially, the famine was unavoidable, and there was nothing anybody could have done. That was Amartya Sen's primary view. Now, Madhushree Mukherjee in her book stated a different view, a more believable view. She emphasized the politics of the time, in particular Churchill's racism, some of the dominating members of the cabinets, war cabinets, or racism as well, the policies which ensured that relief to India was deliberately cut off, whether it be through shipping or other means. Or it is said that during this time, British India used to have its own currency reserves, pound reserves, really, pound sterling reserves. The British, the British Indian government of the time, the colonial government that ruled India, they were not even allowed to use their own sterling reserves to buy food to relieve the famine. Churchill was said to have literally prohibited the release of money to India, or India's own money being used to relieve itself. That was how he went far to kill our people. So all that, then wartime policy, then specific colonial policies which I mentioned about the for exporting food even in the midst of famine, even when it is not sound policy. Then destruction of valuable source of transportation for the local people as a war effort, namely the boat denial policy. Then destroying the agricultural fields to make way for airstrips and other military facilities and factories to aid in the war effort, all of it. Now, this meant that in 1944, when the Indian army began to march on the Japanese in Burma and all, they did so on the skeletons of millions of Indian people who had died at the time. The British did fulfill their objective of using India as a cash cow for the war effort, and as a cash cow in general, as they had done so during the decades of their rule. Of course, for them, for Churchill in particular, the welfare of the Indian people was of no concern to him, for the simple reason that the Indian people had no stake in Churchill's political career. They didn't vote in British elections, so Churchill could do whatsoever he wanted with them without any political repercussions. That he ended up being voted out of power in after the war was entirely due to different reasons, namely the British people's political outlook had changed after the war, and so that the Bengal famine had nothing to do with how Churchill fared. So both of these views, particularly Madhushree Mukherjee's view, it identifies how systems fail human beings on a massive scale. That how particular systems, mind you, systems which are rigged by the people in charge to be in favor of them and anybody associated with them, at the expense of at the expense of the peoples who are subjugated by these systems, how those subjugated peoples end up suffering unnecessarily and tragically from the nature of these systems, colonial systems in particular. Colonialism, the Bengal famine is a classic example of colonialism at its height. How colonial policies, how the system itself prioritizes the ruling powers and their people at the expense of the subjugated peoples. How colonialism was literally an extractive enterprise where the resources of the colonies were ruthlessly plundered and looted and pumped out for the benefit of a select few. Colonialism is essentially a classic case of the needs of the few outweigh those of the many, which is why we must be thank the Bengal. Essentially, this famine and other atrocities highlight how colonialism was a dark time for the subjugated colonial uh, uh, regions, India in particular, which is why we should always remember all this, and that is why we should understand, that is why we should stop romanticizing the British rule in India and remember it for the horrific and tragic era it was, and value the people who gave their lives, their freedom to ensure ours, to ensure our independence, our freedom. The kind of empowered lives we lead now is owed to them. So at the end of this video, now let us all hold a minute of silence in remembrance of these 3 million victims. Well, let us all remember these millions who have been forgotten. The Bengal famine is not something that is taught in school nowadays. It is usually skipped over. People usually are not really aware of this one of the last atrocities of the British Raj. Probably because the elite that ruled India after independence was an English-speaking elite that was beholden to the British in many ways, who had been educated in British universities, who were literally influenced by the British way of thinking and British lifestyle. So, which is why which is why and as par and which is why this famine ended up being thrown under the rug. This famine was later on forgotten along with the other famines. But it is time we remember this famine, remember these 3 million victims, particularly because it is said that India was one of the biggest contributors to the Allied war effort. In fact, it is said that Indian businessmen, Indian farmers, Indian civilians overall, and Indian soldiers also, like 2.5 million Indian soldiers voluntarily partook in the war. So India and Indians ensured the Allied victory of 1945, and their prize was India's rapid independence in 47. But because of the politics of the time, this famine was thrown under the rug, it was forgotten. But we must not forget this. We must remember how these people died, why they died. We must remember this famine as one of the hallmarks of British rule, as a symbol of just how exploitative, how horrific, how oppressive colonial rule was at the time, and we must remember, and we must use this famine as a means to understand just how courageous our Indian freedom fighters were to give their lives, to give their freedom, to stand up to the oppressive administration at the time, and to ensure our liberty, our freedom, our dignity as a fully sovereign and independent country who can look after and manage our own problems without being dependent on the mercy of a distant country who have literally nothing in common with us. So so I would recommend to you all to read Madhushri Mukherjee's Churchill's Secret War book. It is an extremely enlightening, very engaging book, mind you, written in very simple language on how the famine occurred, why it occurred, the truth about it. I would recommend it to you all, and I hope that those of you who are watching this video have been sufficiently enlightened about one of the last atrocities of the British Raj, a story which is not largely known among us Indians, but which we need to understand. Also, because India's story has been a story of famines for centuries, even before the British Raj, mind you. So this famine has not been remembered by us for a long time, but it is time we remembered this. It's time we understood why, how, what happened, so that we understand the true nature of the colonialism, the true gift of independence that has been given to us by the sacrifice of our freedom fighters, so that we cherish and value our independence, our dignity, our freedom, and strive to preserve it by any means necessary. So thank you all for watching this video. Please watch, like, subscribe, and recommend this video to anyone else you know. Please also subscribe and recommend my channel at Siddharth History Z8H to anyone else you know. Thank you all for watching this video. Thank you for your time, all of you. Thank you. Thank you.